Money Killed Him, the unsolved case of Christopher Smith. Warning, this story contains sensitive content and is only suitable for viewers 18 years and older. Legal disclaimer, the following content is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only. Names have been changed to protect identities. Any similarities to real persons or events are coincidental or have been altered for privacy. Introduction. I remember the first time I stepped into that office. The stench hit me like a freight train, a nauseating mixture of industrial strength cleaners, scented candles, and something else, something primal, something wrong. My name is Detective Shin. For over 2 decades, I've specialized in cases that others have abandoned the forgotten victims, the cold trails, the mysteries that haunt families for generations. This case arrived on my desk after it had already been through the system. A man named Christopher Taylor, a promising digital marketing entrepreneur, had vanished without a trace. His business partner claimed he'd sold his share of their successful company and embarked on a worldwide sailing adventure. But as I stood there in that office that day, staring at the newly installed carpeting and freshly painted walls, I knew I was standing in a graveyard. Someone had died here violently, and the killer had gone to extraordinary lengths to cover it up. This is not just another missing person case. This is the story of ambition corrupted by greed, of trust betrayed in the most fundamental way, and of how the pursuit of wealth can transform an ordinary person into a monster. Tonight, I'm going to take you through one of the most disturbing cases I've ever investigated. I'll show you how a successful business partnership between 2 seemingly compatible entrepreneurs ended in deception, embezzlement, and ultimately murder. What would you do if you discovered your trusted business partner had been stealing from your company? Would you confront them, seek legal action? Could you ever imagine that such a confrontation might cost you your life? Let me tell you the story of how money killed Christopher Taylor and how his killer nearly got away with the perfect crime. The promising beginning. Edward Yhon grew up as the only son in a devout Christian immigrant family. From all outward appearances, he was the embodiment of the American dream, academically gifted, athletically talented, and socially adept. His parents, who had built considerable wealth after immigrating, took immense pride in their son's achievements. Every weekend, the young man attended church services and Bible study classes without fail. After graduating college, he married, started a family, and maintained his strong faith, participating enthusiastically in religious activities and volunteer work. I first met Edward through mutual acquaintances at the church, I tell you, recounting my investigation. Everyone described him the same way, dedicated, reliable, the model of Christian virtue. A man who'd quote scripture while helping elderly members of the congregation with their groceries. Edward's life seemed to take an even more positive turn when he met Daniel Grant, who ran a successful lead generation company. Impressed by Edward's diligence and apparent reliability, Daniel offered him a position as the accounting manager. It was there that Edward met Christopher Taylor. The way their colleagues described Christopher was fascinating, I continue. He was everything Edward wasn't: free-spirited, creative, single, always pursuing new adventures and experiences. Where Edward was structured and precise, Christopher was innovative and spontaneous. Christopher managed marketing for Daniel's company, while Edward handled the finances. Despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, they developed a close professional relationship. Christopher quickly recognized Edward's potential and saw in him the perfect complement to his own skills. Where Christopher wore casual jeans and T-shirts to the office, Edward always appeared in immaculate suits. Christopher enjoyed surfing and socializing, while Edward spent weekends with his wife and 3 children attending church services. Yet somehow, these 2 vastly different personalities found common ground: entrepreneurship. Have you ever met someone who seemed to perfectly balance your own strengths and weaknesses? I ask. That's how colleagues describe this pair. An ideal match of complementary skills, Edward's financial acumen and Christopher's marketing genius. In late 2008, they made their move. They resigned from Daniel's company and established 800 Xchange, a digital marketing consulting company with a 50-50 ownership split. Their business model was straightforward but effective. They provided marketing strategies to other businesses, promising to boost sales and strengthen brand recognition. The division of labor was logical. Christopher handled marketing and sales, while Edward managed finances and company operations. And this is where the story should have become a triumphant tale of entrepreneurial success, I tell you. Their company took off immediately. Their former employer, Daniel, became their first client, and the spectacular results they achieved spread quickly through word of mouth. Within months, orders were flooding in. Their revenue increased by over 100 each year. Both partners were earning substantial incomes with seemingly limitless potential for growth. Christopher was ecstatic. He'd found the perfect business partner and was living his entrepreneurial dream. The future couldn't have looked brighter. But there was something Christopher didn't know about his partner, something that would ultimately cost him his life, the dark secret. When investigating a homicide, I've learned that the most important question isn't always who did it, I explain, walking through the reconstructed crime scene. Sometimes it's why. What drives a person to take another's life? In this case, the answer was hiding in plain sight for years. Edward had an obsession with money that bordered on pathological. Since childhood, he declared his intention to become a millionaire before turning 30. This wasn't just a dream, it was an all-consuming fixation. The depths of this obsession were revealed during my investigation when I uncovered a shocking incident from Edward's past. Imagine this, I say. A young man so desperate for money that he creates an alias Curtis and calls his wealthy father with a disguised voice, claiming to have kidnapped his own son. He demanded $1 million for the son's safe return. When his father hesitated to pay, Edward repeatedly sent ransom emails. The scheme collapsed when police traced the IP address to the family's home, revealing that a family member had staged the kidnapping. Think about that for a moment. I pause. What kind of person would put their own parents through that kind of psychological torture? For money? His parents finally cut ties with him after this incident, but Edward's nature remained unchanged. Even his participation in Bible study had an ulterior motive. He approached wealthy, influential members of the congregation, treating them with special care and attention. That's how he met Daniel Grant, I continue, not through shared faith or principles, but because Daniel represented a pathway to wealth. My investigation revealed that Edward had a criminal record for fraud. He'd leveraged his church connections to gain access to Susan Fallenberg, who ran a magazine company. Her husband was in the final stages of cancer, and she wanted to sell the business for $1 million to enjoy her retirement. Edward portrayed himself as a devout Christian and caring father, the perfect buyer. The couple trusted him and agreed to sell him the company. But when it came time to sign the contract, Edward claimed he couldn't afford the full amount and would need to pay in installments. He also demanded that shares be transferred immediately so he could become a director. They made the fatal mistake that so many victims of confidence tricksters make, I tell you. They trusted the persona rather than verifying the person. After receiving the shares, effectively gaining control of the company, Edward repeatedly failed to make payments, offering endless excuses. When the couple sued, Edward hired someone to visit their home with threats. Fearing for their safety, the elderly couple withdrew the lawsuit. Edward never intended to run that company, I explained. He quickly sold it at a discount and pocketed the money without having invested a cent of his own. Despite his outwardly pious demeanor, Edward had revealed his true nature. He would do anything for money. But all of this was unknown to Christopher when they formed their partnership. He believed he'd found the perfect business partner, someone reliable, trustworthy, and financially savvy. Their company, 800 Xchange, was growing exponentially. They should have been focused on expansion and innovation. Instead, Edward's attention had shifted elsewhere, to the casinos of Las Vegas, the downward spiral. There's a pattern I've observed in cases like this, I tell you, spreading photographs across the table, a gradual transition from minor ethical lapses to increasingly serious crimes. Edward's descent followed this pattern exactly. Initially, Edward would travel to Las Vegas with about $2,000, telling himself it was just for entertainment. But beginner's luck, or perhaps skill with numbers, led to early wins. Those wins triggered something in his brain, a chemical reaction that would grow into full-blown addiction. Gambling addicts describe a euphoria unlike any other when they win, I explained. For someone already obsessed with money like Edward, the casino environment was like throwing gasoline on an open flame. The scale of his bets increased steadily. Before long, he had depleted his personal savings. But rather than step back and acknowledge his problem, he turned his attention to the company's funds. This is where his expertise in accounting became dangerous, I continue. He developed a sophisticated scheme to embezzle money without Christopher noticing. Edward began overcharging client companies for marketing costs and pocketing the difference. Over time, these small siphons accumulated to nearly $900,000, almost $1 million stolen from their clients, and by extension, from his own business partner. Armed with this illicit cash, Edward returned to the casinos with increasing frequency. Have you ever wanted something so badly that you began justifying small compromises? I ask. That's how it starts. But where does it end? For Edward, the answer would be murder. The scheme might have continued indefinitely if not for a chance encounter. Daniel Grant, their first and most important client, happened to be at the same casino in Las Vegas. He spotted Edward at a high-stakes table with tens of thousands of dollars in chips. Daniel's suspicion was immediate. How could Edward afford to gamble such large amounts? This led him to review the marketing costs his company had been charged, where he discovered the systematic overcharging. Furious, Daniel contacted 800 Xchange and demanded compensation. This forced Christopher, the co-founder, to confront the devastating betrayal by his partner. Put yourself in Christopher's position, I say. You've built a thriving business based on trust and partnership, only to discover your partner has been stealing from your clients. What would you do? Christopher was understandably angry, but his primary concern was the company's reputation. If word spread about Edward's embezzlement, they could lose all their clients overnight. The company they'd worked so hard to build would be destroyed. His first instinct was to check the company accounts to assess the damage. But here, he encountered unexpected resistance. Edward prevented him from accessing the financial records, offering various excuses. This was the moment when Christopher should have recognized the true danger, I observed. When a business partner refuses financial transparency, it's rarely because they have good news to share. Despite being a co-director with equal authority, Christopher couldn't view the company's financial records because Edward had exclusive control of the passwords and account information. By May 2010, Christopher had reached his limit. He prepared to sue Edward while simultaneously proposing settlement terms that were remarkably reasonable given the circumstances. 1. Edward would admit to the embezzlement. 2. He would return all overcharged funds to Daniel's company. 3. He would share all account passwords for complete transparency. 4. Going forward, all financial transactions would require both partners' signatures. These weren't punitive demands, I point out. They were basic protections to save the business. Most people in Christopher's position would have pressed charges immediately. Edward found himself cornered. He had already lost the embezzled money to gambling and had no means to repay it. He faced two options: comply with Christopher's terms and potentially face criminal charges, or the alternative was unthinkable to most people, but Edward wasn't most people. In early June 2010, Christopher Taylor disappeared. The disappearance. When a person goes missing, the first 48 hours are critical, I explained, flipping through the case file. But what happens when no one realizes they're missing for days or even weeks? What happens when the person who knows they're gone is actively creating the illusion that they're still alive? Christopher's parents returned home after a week-long trip to find their son wasn't there. Initially, they weren't concerned. He had been stressed about work recently and might have taken a spontaneous vacation. But when they couldn't reach him by phone, their worry grew. Eventually, they called Edward, thinking he might know his partner's whereabouts. This is where Edward's deception becomes truly sophisticated, I tell you. Listen to what he told the parents. Edward claimed he had met with Christopher the day before. According to Edward, Christopher had decided to sell his 50 share of the company for $1 million and step away from the business entirely. Edward said they had celebrated with wine at the office, and Christopher had gotten very drunk. After that, Edward claimed not to know where Christopher had gone. Consider the calculated nature of this lie, I say. It established multiple false narratives simultaneously: that Christopher was alive, that he had willingly sold his share of the company, and that Edward had legitimately acquired full ownership. Christopher's parents were confused. Their son had been fighting to protect the company, even preparing to sue Edward for embezzlement. Why would he suddenly sell his share to the very person he was planning to sue? It didn't make sense. But on the second day after Christopher's disappearance, they received an email from their son's account. "Mom, Dad, I've resolved the company's business well. I bought a yacht with the money received from Edward and plan to travel around the world. I'm currently in the Galapagos Islands and will be home in about 3 weeks. I was too entangled with the company. Now I'm happy. If your child sent you an email like this, would you question it? I ask. Most parents would be relieved to hear from their child, especially if they were worried. Over the next 6 months, Christopher's parents received periodic emails from their son's account. Each message described a new exotic location, Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, creating the impression of an extended international vacation. Think about how technology has changed the way we perceive presents, I observe. In the past, if someone was gone, they were gone. Today, digital communications can create the illusion of presence even when someone has been dead for months. Eventually, Christopher's parents began to sense something was wrong. The writing style in the recent emails seemed different from their son's usual communication. The tone, word choice, even the rhythm of the sentences felt off. Then came the email that shattered the illusion. The past year and a half has been like a nightmare. I've endured too much stress. Now, I just want to end my life. This alarming message, so different from the previous cheerful travelogues, terrified them. After this email, all communication ceased completely. When communication suddenly stops after a concerning message like that, what's your first thought? I ask. Suicide? Or something else entirely? Christopher's parents immediately hired a private detective and requested verification of their son's passport records. The results confirmed their worst fears. There was no evidence Christopher had left the United States since June 2010. Additionally, analysis of the email IP addresses revealed that all the messages had been sent from within the United States, not from the international locations described in their content. This is the midpoint in our story, I tell you, where a missing person case transforms into a suspected homicide. And here's where I entered the picture. A missing person report was filed with the authorities, and Edward, as the last person known to have seen Christopher, became the primary suspect. However, the police proceeded cautiously, knowing they needed concrete evidence before making any accusations. The investigation deepens. When I first reviewed this case, what struck me wasn't just the crime itself, I say, but the extraordinary efforts to conceal it. Few murders involve such elaborate staging afterward. As the investigation progressed, crucial testimony came from company employees. Around the time of Christopher's disappearance, Edward had suddenly granted special leave to all staff. His explanation was that Christopher had gotten drunk the night before, vomiting and urinating in the office, and Edward needed time to clean everything up. When employees returned after their unexpected break, they immediately noticed something strange, a heavy, unpleasant odor permeating the office. It wasn't the smell of vomit, but something more disturbing, a fishy, metallic stench partially masked by scented candles and air fresheners. Ask any homicide detective about the smell of blood. I tell you solemnly, it's distinctive and nearly impossible to completely eliminate, especially when there's a large quantity. Another employee reported that after the break, the golf clubs and baseball bat that were always visible in Edward's office had disappeared. What would you think if you heard that? I asked. Potential murder weapons removed from the scene? Based on these testimonies, police obtained a warrant and conducted a thorough forensic examination of the office. Despite Edward's cleaning efforts, luminol testing revealed extensive blood evidence on the carpet, walls, and ceiling. DNA analysis confirmed it was all Christopher's blood. The volume of blood found was inconsistent with any scenario except homicide, I explained. The spatter patterns indicated multiple blunt force impacts, violent, repeated striking. Realizing the investigation was closing in, Edward attempted to flee to Canada, but was apprehended at the airport due to a travel ban that had been issued. During initial questioning, Edward maintained a surprisingly confident demeanor. He questioned why police were asking about Christopher's whereabouts when he had gone traveling. But when confronted with the blood evidence, his story changed dramatically. This is typical of sophisticated liars, I note. They maintain the original lie until it becomes untenable, then pivot to a new narrative that accounts for the new evidence while still attempting to minimize their culpability. Edward now admitted that Christopher was dead, but claimed it was an accident, an act of self-defense. According to his new story, while they were drafting their agreement, Christopher had suddenly attacked him, attempting to strangle him. Edward claimed he had pushed Christopher away in self-defense, causing Christopher to hit his head on the desk and die instantly. He justified not reporting the death by saying that because he was being accused of embezzlement, he feared the police would suspect him of murder. Let's analyze this new claim, I suggest. If someone dies accidentally during a confrontation, would your first instinct be to dispose of the body, clean up all evidence, and then send fake emails for months pretending to be the deceased? Or would you call emergency services immediately? When asked about the location of Christopher's body, Edward maintained absolute silence. Even when investigators discovered he had rented a truck and driven to a desert area near the Mexican border, he refused to disclose what he had done with Christopher's remains. I've interviewed many killers over the years, I tell you. When they refuse to reveal the location of a body, it's usually for one of two reasons. Either the manner of death would disprove their version of events, or they believe that without a body, they cannot be convicted. Edward's only explanation for the desert trip was that he had initially planned to escape to Mexico, but changed his mind and returned. The body's location remained and still remains a mystery. The climactic revelation: every investigation has a moment when the pieces begin to align, I say, spreading crime scene photographs across the table. For me, it came when we recovered deleted files from Edward's computer. 6 months into my investigation, our digital forensics team managed to recover data that Edward thought he had permanently erased. Among the files were drafts of the emails sent from Christopher's account, irrefutable proof that Edward had been impersonating his missing partner. But more disturbing were the financial records. They revealed not just the embezzlement Christopher had discovered, but something far worse. Edward had been systematically looting the company for over a year, transferring funds to offshore accounts. This changed everything about our understanding of the case, I explained. It wasn't just about covering up embezzlement from clients. Edward had been stealing from the company itself, from his partner, on a massive scale. The record showed that by the time Christopher confronted him, Edward had already embezzled over $2-3 million from their joint business. Christopher's proposal for financial transparency would have immediately exposed not just the client overcharging, but this much larger theft. Now, the motive came into sharp focus, I continue. Edward wasn't just trying to avoid repaying $900,000 to clients. He was facing exposure for millions in theft, potential criminal charges, and the complete destruction of his reputation in the business community. Another breakthrough came when we interviewed a casino employee who recognized Edward from his frequent visits. This witness recalled seeing Edward engaged in a heated phone call the night before Christopher disappeared. According to this witness, Edward was shouting into his phone, "You don't understand. If this gets out, I'm finished. I need more time." Then, more ominously, "There's no other way. It has to be handled." We also discovered that Edward had purchased several items in the days before Christopher's disappearance: industrial strength cleaning supplies, plastic sheeting, a reciprocating saw, and garbage bags. These are not the purchases of someone preparing for a business meeting, I observe. These are the purchases of someone planning to clean up a crime scene. The most damning evidence came from Edward's search history. In the weeks before Christopher disappeared, he had searched for information on how to dissolve a human body. Can police trace emails if sent from different locations? How long before missing person is declared dead? Can you be convicted of murder without a body? Ask yourself, I say, are these the searches of an innocent person who later had to defend himself in an unexpected attack? Or are they the searches of someone methodically planning a murder? When confronted with this evidence, Edward maintained his silence about the body's location, but made an unexpected admission through his attorney. He acknowledged sending the emails from Christopher's account and admitted to the embezzlement. However, he still insisted that Christopher's death was accidental, the result of self-defense during a confrontation. This partial confession strategy is common, I explain. Admit to the lesser crimes that can be proven beyond doubt, but maintain innocence on the most serious charge. The prosecution faced a significant challenge: building a murder case without a body. Without Christopher's remains, it would be difficult to disprove Edward's claim of self-defense. The forensic evidence showed that Christopher had died violently in the office, but not necessarily how he had died. This is why killers go to such lengths to conceal bodies, I tell you. Without an autopsy, there's no way to distinguish between a single defensive push resulting in a fatal head injury and a brutal, premeditated attack with a golf club. As the case progressed toward trial, we continued searching for Christopher's remains, following every possible lead. We conducted extensive searches in the desert area where Edward had been tracked, but found nothing. Here's where I need to ask you something important, I say, leaning forward. If you were on a jury, could you convict someone of murder without a body, with only circumstantial evidence? How certain would you need to be? The trial and aftermath on November 13, 2018, more than 8 years after Christopher's disappearance, Edward went on trial for murder. The length of time between the crime and trial isn't unusual in complex cases, I explain. Building a case without a body, gathering forensic evidence, and preparing for trial are all time-consuming processes. The prosecution presented a compelling case based on the extensive blood evidence in the office, Edward's computer searches before the murder, the fake emails sent from Christopher's account, the financial record showing extensive embezzlement, Edward's purchase of cleaning supplies and tools, his attempted flight to Canada. But the defense had a simple counter-narrative, I continue. They claimed that everything after Christopher's death, the cleanup, the disposal of the body, the fake emails, was simply panic, not evidence of premeditation. Edward's attorney argued that while his client had made terrible decisions after Christopher's accidental death, those actions didn't prove he had intended to kill his partner. He portrayed Edward as a frightened man who made a series of poor choices after a tragic accident. It's a strategy designed to create reasonable doubt, I explained. Accept the undeniable facts, but contest the interpretation. Yes, Christopher died in the office. Yes, Edward disposed of the body and lied about it. But was it murder or a tragic accident followed by panic? After a lengthy deliberation, the jury reached their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Edward was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Even without a body, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, I tell you. The jury simply didn't believe that an innocent man would go to such elaborate lengths to conceal an accidental death. Following the conviction, Christopher's family visited Edward in prison multiple times, begging him to reveal the location of their son's remains. They wanted closure, the ability to give Christopher a proper burial and say goodbye. Even then, Edward remained silent. He refused to disclose where he had hidden Christopher's body. His continued silence speaks volumes, I observe. If Christopher's death truly was accidental, revealing the body's location could only help Edward's case. An autopsy might show a single head injury consistent with his story. But if the body showed multiple blunt force traumas from a golf club or baseball bat, it would demolish his self-defense claim. To this day, Christopher's family continues their search for his remains. They've hired private investigators and organized volunteer search parties in the desert areas where Edward was known to have traveled. The absence of a body is not just a legal challenge, I explain. It's a profound psychological burden for the victims' families. Without that closure, the grieving process remains incomplete. Edward's refusal to reveal the location of Christopher's remains, even after his conviction, suggests a disturbing possibility: that he maintains hope of eventual release and fears that the body might contain evidence that would permanently eliminate that possibility. The aftermath: lessons in trust and betrayal. As I look back on this case, I tell you, gathering the photos and files, I'm struck by how preventable this tragedy was. There were warning signs about Edward's character that, in hindsight, seem obvious. Edward's history of fraud, his staged kidnapping of himself, his treatment of Susan Fallenberg and her dying husband all pointed to a man who valued money above all else, including human relationships. But we tend to see what we want to see in others, I observe. Christopher saw in Edward the perfect business partner, someone with complementary skills who could handle the financial side while he focused on marketing and sales. That trust, the willingness to cede complete control of the company's finances to someone without adequate oversight, created the vulnerable situation that Edward exploited. There's a broader lesson here about partnership and trust, I suggest. In business and in life, trust must be accompanied by verification. No matter how much you trust someone, certain safeguards should always be in place. I mention a few simple practices that might have saved Christopher's life. Regular financial audits by independent third parties, requiring dual signatures on large transactions, transparent access to all financial records for both partners, clear separation of personal and business finances. These aren't signs of distrust, I emphasize. They're prudent practices that protect everyone involved. Had these been in place from the beginning, Edward's embezzlement would have been discovered much sooner, before the situation became desperate. But the case also reveals something darker about human nature: how the pursuit of money can corrupt even those who appear most virtuous on the surface. Edward presented himself as a devoted Christian, a family man, Someone who valued honesty and integrity, I note. Yet behind that facade was someone willing to kill his own business partner to maintain his lifestyle and avoid the consequences of his actions. This disconnect between public persona and private character is something I've seen repeatedly in my career. The most dangerous predators are often those who have mastered the art of appearing trustworthy. What would you do if you discovered a close associate someone you trusted had been stealing from you? I ask. Would you confront them directly, as Christopher did, or would you involve others for protection? Christopher's direct confrontation with Edward, while honest and forthright, placed him in danger. Had he involved lawyers, police, or even mutual friends in that confrontation, Edward might not have felt empowered to resort to violence. I'm not suggesting Christopher was responsible for his own murder, I clarify. The responsibility lies entirely with Edward. But understanding how vulnerable moments arise can help others avoid similar situations. The case also demonstrates how technological skills can be used to extend deception. By sending emails from Christopher's account, Edward created a digital ghost, a simulated presence that delayed the discovery of the crime for months. In today's world, we need to be more vigilant about unusual changes in communication patterns, I advise. If someone who typically calls suddenly switches to text-only communication, or if their writing style changes, it might warrant closer attention. The moral reckoning. As our time together draws to a close, I reflect on the deeper meaning of this case and what it teaches us about human nature. Money in itself isn't evil, I say quietly, but the obsessive pursuit of wealth, the willingness to sacrifice ethical principles for financial gain, that's where the danger lies. Edward's path from ambitious young entrepreneur to murderer wasn't a sudden transformation. It occurred through a series of increasingly serious ethical compromises. First, the fraudulent dealings, then gambling with company money, then embezzlement, and finally, murder. Each step made the next one easier, I observe. Each compromise of conscience weakened his moral resistance until he could contemplate an act that most of us would find unthinkable. This gradual erosion of ethical boundaries is something we should all be vigilant about in our own lives. Small compromises can lead to larger ones over time. Ask yourself, what boundaries would you never cross? What principles would you never compromise, regardless of the potential reward? I suggest establishing those ethical lines clearly in your mind before facing temptation is crucial. Christopher's story also reminds us of the importance of transparency in our relationships, both personal and professional. Secrets, especially financial ones, create dangerous power imbalances. In your own relationships, strive for transparency, I advise. Not because you distrust others, but because clarity protects everyone involved. The most tragic aspect of this case is that Christopher's body has never been found. His family continues to live in that painful limbo between grief and uncertainty. Imagine being unable to say goodbye to someone you love, I say, unable to visit their final resting place, unable to complete that essential human ritual of mourning. Edward could end their suffering with a few simple words, yet he chooses to maintain his silence, a final act of cruelty that extends his crime beyond his incarceration. What does this tell us about the capacity for empathy in someone who has crossed such moral lines? I ask. Once we prioritize self-interest above all else, does our ability to recognize the humanity in others diminish? As I pack away the case files, I leave you with a final thought. The pursuit of wealth and success is not inherently wrong. But when that pursuit becomes so consuming that we're willing to harm others to achieve it, we've lost something far more valuable than any amount of money could replace our humanity. A final appeal. Before I go, I want to speak directly to anyone who might have information about Christopher Taylor's remains. It's been years since this crime occurred, I say. Edward may have confided in someone about where he disposed of the body. Perhaps someone saw something unusual in the desert areas near the Mexican border in early June 2010. Even the smallest detail could lead to the discovery of Christopher's remains and bring peace to his family. If you know something, please come forward, I urge. You can contact law enforcement anonymously. This family deserves closure after all these years of uncertainty. And to all of you who have listened to this story, I hope it serves as both a warning and a reminder to be careful about who you trust with your finances, to maintain transparency in your business relationships, and most importantly, to recognize that no amount of money is worth compromising your fundamental values. Share this story with those you care about, I suggest, not to spread fear, but to spread wisdom. The lessons here might save someone from a similar fate. In my decades investigating human behavior at its worst, I've learned that prevention is always better than justice after the fact. No conviction, no matter how satisfying, can bring Christopher back to his family. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of my most disturbing cases, I conclude. If this story has affected you, please consider subscribing to my channel for more insights into unsolved crimes and the human factors behind them. Remember, the greatest protection against becoming a victim is awareness. Stay vigilant, verify what you're told, and never be afraid to ask questions when something doesn't feel right. This is Detective Shernan, signing off until our next investigation.